A cargo ship can be about 400 meters long, yet it still has to squeeze through a canal that is only a few hundred meters wide in places. When that canal slows down, your phone case, your coffee machine parts, and even your medicines can end up waiting in a floating traffic jam. In March 2021, the container ship Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal and blocked it for days. Analysts warned that the shock could cost global trade billions per week, and shipping delays rippled for weeks after the ship was freed. That incident wasn't a one-off weird accident. In 2023 and 2024, security risks in the Red Sea pushed many ships to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding distance, time, and cost. UN trade officials warned that the Suez Canal normally handles a major share of world trade, and traffic dropped sharply during the disruption. Here's the awkward truth. Even when ships keep moving, we have built a world where one narrow waterway can act like a valve on the global economy. Most world trade by volume still travels by sea, so an ocean route stumble, nearly everyone feels it. So the big question becomes simple. If the sea is the main highway, what's the backup road when the highway is jammed? And that's where a project with a very unsexy name starts to sound like a plot twist: the International North-South Transport Corridor, also called INSTC. The title says the trillion-dollar rail line that could replace every cargo ship. But the first twist is this: INSTC is not a single rail line, and no official invoice says $1 trillion for one build. It is a network, ship, rail, and road stitched together across countries, with upgrades happening in pieces at different speeds for different reasons. The trillion-dollar part is really the scale of what it tries to touch: the flow of trade between the Indian Ocean and markets in Russia and Europe, trade that normally depends heavily on long ocean routes and choke points like Suez. INSTC began as a formal idea in 2000, when India, Iran, and Russia signed an intergovernmental agreement to improve trade and transport connectivity along the route. In plain words, let's build a north-south bridge so cargo doesn't have to loop around the long way. And yes, one commonly cited description puts the corridor at about 7,200 kilometers of combined routes. That number matters because it signals what this really is: a huge logistics puzzle, not a single ribbon-cutting moment. The classic sea route from India to Europe often runs through the Arabian Sea, up the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, then across the Mediterranean. That's a lot of water, and it's vulnerable to the kinds of disruptions we've already seen. INSTC offers a different shape on the map. Cargo can move by ship from Indian ports to Iran, then travel north over land by rail and road, then cross into the Caucasus and Russia, and from there connect onward to Europe through existing rail networks. There isn't just one INSTC path. Many corridor studies describe multiple branches, like a western route through Azerbaijan, and a route that uses the Caspian Sea as a middle hop between Iran and Russia. That flexibility is part of the point. If one segment is slow, another can carry some of the load. Supporters often repeat a bold promise: faster, cheaper delivery compared with the Suez route. Some studies cite estimates like 40% shorter and 30% cheaper, and they mention long transit times on certain lanes through Suez. Those are estimates, not guarantees. Real transit times depend on ports, paperwork, rail capacity, weather, and politics. But even as a best-case benchmark, the promise is clear: cut the long loop, cut the waiting, and cut the number of single points of failure. Let's make it human scale. Think of a container filled with auto parts, textiles, or medicine, goods that lose value when they sit still. The ship route is reliable most of the time, but when it breaks, schedules fall apart. On the INSTC path, that container can leave India by sea and land at an Iranian port. Iran's port projects matter here because the corridor needs a strong southern gate that can handle containers smoothly. One port that keeps showing up in the story is Chabahar, on Iran's Gulf of Oman coast. On May 13, 2024, India signed a 10-year contract with Iran to develop and operate part of the port, strengthening a route that helps India reach Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia while bypassing Pakistan. Now the container's job changes. At sea, it's mostly about fuel and distance. On land, it becomes about borders, rail schedules, and whether cranes and yards can move a steel box from ship to train without losing days. This is where custom systems matter as much as tracks. One tool countries use to reduce border friction is the TIR transit system, a UN-backed customs transit procedure designed to cut delays and simplify movement across borders. If that paperwork works, the container can roll north across Iran toward the Caspian Sea region and the border areas that link into the Caucasus and Russia. If it doesn't, you can have a perfect railway and still lose the time advantage at the checkpoint. Here's the second twist. The biggest bottleneck in a 7,200-kilometer corridor can be a missing piece shorter than a commute. One widely discussed missing link is the Rasht-Astara railway segment in northern Iran. On May 17, 2023, reports described Russia and Iran overseeing a deal related to this railway and framed it as a key part of a corridor Russia said could rival the Suez route. Why does this short segment matter so much? Because it connects Iran's rail network up toward the Azerbaijan border area, turning a patchwork of roads and transfers into a more continuous rail spine. Russia's interest isn't subtle. Analysts have described plans for Russia to finance the Rasht-Astara project itself, including a large loan to Iran, an extraordinary move that shows how strategic this corridor has become for Moscow. By October 30, 2025, reports described detailed construction plans for the line, around 162 kilometers with multiple stations and a large number of bridges and crossings. The specifics matter because they hint at the real work: land acquisition, engineering, and time. Until that link is finished, INSTC can still function, but with more handoffs, more delays, and more chances for one weak seam to slow the whole garment. Now we have to deal honestly with the title's biggest claim: replacing every cargo ship. Global shipping carries most of the world's trade by volume. That is not a number a rail corridor can simply erase, because oceans are still the cheapest way to move huge quantities over long distances. What rail can do is different. It can pull a slice of cargo away from choke points, especially cargo where time matters more than the absolute lowest cost. It can also serve as insurance when a sea route is disrupted. And it can change bargaining power. If exporters and importers have one extra usable route, the world gets less hostage to one canal, one strait, or one week-long crisis. But there's a catch. Rail has its own choke points. One of the most technical and least sexy is track gauge. Iran uses a standard gauge of 1435 millimeters, while Russia and several nearby countries used 1520 millimeters. That difference can force cargo to be transferred or rolling stock to be adjusted at borders. In other words, if you want a corridor that feels like one smooth rail highway, you don't just build a track. You build terminals, equipment, border systems, and agreements that make the switch invisible to the customer. There's another reason INSTC is hard to treat like a normal megaproject: politics. Iran and Russia have both faced heavy sanctions pressure for years, and that creates permission slip problems for finance, insurance, and payments, basic tools any logistics chain needs to run smoothly. Chabahar is a good example of this tightrope. On October 30, 2025, reports said the United States granted India a 6-month exemption from sanctions related to its work at Chabahar. That kind of temporary waiver shows how a port can be strategically important, yet still live under legal uncertainty. On January 16, 2026, India's foreign ministry said it remained engaged with the United States on a conditional Chabahar-related sanctions waiver and that the guidance was valid until April 26, 2026. For planners, that kind of date matters because logistics is built on confidence. This is why the corridor is often described as both an economic project and a geopolitical project. It doesn't just move boxes, it rearranges who depends on whom. If the missing links get built and the paperwork gets smoother, the most immediate change is speed on certain lanes. Supporters point to the possibility of moving freight between India and Russia or Europe faster than the long Suez path, at least for some kinds of cargo. The second change is resilience. Trade officials have warned that choke points like Suez and Panama are increasingly exposed to geopolitics and climate stress, and the disruptions can extend routes and raise costs. A usable land and sea corridor offers a way to avoid putting all your eggs in one canal. The third change is competition. When a new route becomes real, old routes respond through pricing, service, and investment. Even if INSTC never replaces ships, it can still push the global system to behave differently. But the final change might be psychological. Once you know there is a backup route, the map in your head changes. Trade stops feeling like one obvious line on the ocean and starts feeling like a network, one that can bend around trouble. So, is INSTC a $1 trillion rail line that replaces every cargo ship? No, it's something more realistic, and in some ways more powerful. It is an attempt to build redundancy into global trade, a north-south spine that can carry more traffic when the east-west sea highway is stressed. And its fate may come down to a set of unglamorous details: a 162-kilometer railway in northern Iran, a few border procedures, a few port upgrades, and a few political decisions that determine whether operators can insure, pay, and plan with confidence. If those pieces lock into place, the corridor won't end the era of cargo ships, but it could end the era where a single canal feels like a single point of failure for half the planet.